Hello again. So this is me, I think you know who I am, recording another video lecture for you on Foucault's history of sexuality. Before I get into the lecture, two quick remarks. I hope you're keeping reasonably well, not getting too depressed about the fact that you're not able to go out much anymore. I know it's an unpleasant situation. I have to admit that I myself am beginning to feel a little bit, what should I say, too much confined to my house. It's unusual if one has to spend most of one's day inside without being able, in my case, to drive out to Maynooth and go to my office and converse with my colleagues and meet students, etc., etc. So anyway, I drove to the little paint factory. I think that wasn't allowed. There's a little paint factory just across the N4 here. And I got myself a big bucket of black fence paint, and I've started painting the fence around my house. It needed painting, so that at least gives me a little bit of a non-intellectual activity outside of the house, and I hope that will contribute to keeping me sane, since I have to give lectures to you until the end of the semester. Anyway, sorry about joking, but well, yeah, I think we all have to do small things to keep ourselves balanced. Second point, many thanks for submitting your essays. Most of you have submitted your essays. A few have asked for extensions, which, given the circumstances, I've granted. That's really not a big problem at all. Thomas Moston has now started reading your essays and is going to mark them. If he has any questions about marks or about the comments he's going to make, he's going to consult with me, but he is responsible for the marking of the first essays. I am going to be the one to read and mark your second essays, that is to say those essays that are going to be about Foucault and about which we will talk in due course. Talk, well, obviously not in person, but over Moodle. I'm going to solicit suggestions again, and then I'm also going to announce the deadline. Quick remark on that. The philosophy department will make sure that the deadlines for your final essays will be appropriately staggered. That is to say, we will make sure that not all your essays come due certainly on the same day or even in the same week, but there will be, for the various modules that you're taking in third year, there will be about a week between the deadlines for the essay submission for the various modules. You're also welcome to, because obviously I realize philosophy is not a single honor subject in Maynooth, so you have other subjects. You are very welcome to consult with your module lecturers or with me should there be conflicts between deadlines, conflicts so serious that you think you can't deal with them. In that case, we will accommodate you, obviously, because we want you to succeed, and we don't want you to panic and think that you can't do your work. All right. So then, let me get into Foucault. What are we going to treat today? Well, History of Sexuality, Volume 1, that goes without saying. We're going to read Part 2, Chapter 2, which covers pages, just quickly looking at it, pages 36 to 49. The title of this chapter is The Perverse Implantation. All right. Just a quick summary in about 1 minute of the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, Foucault argues that the standard account, the standard narrative regarding sexuality in the Victorian age, or since the beginning of the 17th, in the 18th century, 19th century, the standard account according to which there was simply increasing repression is not accurate. Rather, what we see is, again, according to Foucault, a transformation of sex into discourse. He uses that expression, I don't know how many times, 3 or 4 times in the previous chapter. So if you want to try to remember the content of chapter 1 of part 2 in just 3 or 4 words, it would be the transformation of sex into discourse. That's the thesis that he argues. So instead of repression, we have endless talk about sexuality. Now to chapter 2, the perverse implantation. He begins, as he does so often, with an objection to himself, to his own argument. The objection comes from something like a Marxist quarter, or a quarter of people, theoreticians, intellectuals, who want to offer a criticism of bourgeois society. And these people could object to Foucault's argument that, all right, there may have been an explosion of discourse regarding sexuality in the modern age, 17th century and onward. But the point of this was, and I quote page 36, to say no to unproductive activities. So there was a lot of talk, but the talk had a practical effect. So the argument goes, so the counter-argument against Foucault goes. There may have been a lot of talk, but the objective of this talk was to say no to unproductive activities, to banish casual pleasures, to reduce or exclude practices whose object was not procreation. And why, according to these hypothetical critics, why did this sexual discourse try to repress unproductive sexual activities? Well, Foucault writes at the top of page 37, this was to constitute a sexuality that is economically useful and politically conservative. So there was, so the counter-argument goes, in fact, repression. Repression occurred by means of talk about sex, negative talk, censorship, with the political goal and economic goal to bring about a sexuality serving, well, one could say, bourgeois capitalism, right? Economically useful, making sure people don't disperse their energies in all kinds of sexual pleasures that are not useful to the economy, and politically conservative. Well, let's keep people in check, so that they continue to serve our conservative society. But that's the counter-argument, with which Foucault does not agree. He says he's not sure. I still do not know, he writes, whether this is the ultimate objective. It's also interesting. He doesn't say this is totally wrong. He says, I still do not know, page 37, by the way, whether this is the ultimate objective. He rather thinks, and this is now his own thesis that he's going to argue in the chapter that we're in the process of reading, his own argument is, our epoch has initiated sexual heterogeneities. So we're not just dealing with saying no to sex, etc., but we're dealing with a movement towards initiating sexual heterogeneities. What are heterogeneities? Well, other different forms of sexuality. Different from what? Well, we're going to see in a second. Okay. In the next paragraph, I'm now on pages 37 and 38. Okay? In the next paragraph, Foucault uses a strategy that he uses often, not only in this work, but throughout his works. He loves to contrast different historical epochs. To say such and such a thing happened typically before modernity, then a change occurred in modernity, and then usually within modernity he distinguishes a couple of epochs. So again here he juxtaposes two different approaches to sexuality. He says up to the end of the 18th century, and by the way, you may have noticed that would be a possible point of critique here of Foucault. Does he really, get the whole the historical dates right? Because he will sometimes say up to at the end of the 17th century something happened, at the beginning of the 17th century, in the 17th century. So he doesn't seem to be completely accurate regarding this. For someone who wanted to read the history of sexuality critically and study ways in which the argument is perhaps weak or could be strengthened, attention to the historical account that Foucault gives and its accuracy would certainly be something useful. But at any rate, so up to the end of the 18th century, Foucault argues here on pages 37-38, the discussion of and regulation of sex was centered, he says, on matrimonial relations, that is to say, on marriage. He distinguishes here three ways in which, as he says, up to the end of the 18th century, sexuality was regulated. He mentions canon law, which means church law, Christian pastoral, what is pastoral? Well, that has to do with spiritual counseling, confession, etc. And thirdly, he mentioned civil law. Well, what civil law is, I think, doesn't require any explanation. Now, in these three areas, Foucault argues, there was interest in sexuality and there was discussion of sexuality with an attempt to regulate it, but all this centered on marriage. So there was a great interest to make sure that, first of all, people marry first of all, people don't marry anyone who is too close a relation. Then another question that arose was, what happens with a marriage when one of the partners is either impotent or infertile? Is this a valid marriage or is it not? Another question that arose was, what is sexually allowed within a marriage even? What sexual acts are permissible, which ones aren't, etc., etc. But all this discourse focused on marriage itself. Whereas, according to Foucault, any kind of sexuality that occurred outside of marriage did not attract a lot of interest or a lot of regulation. As he says, 37 towards the bottom, the rest, which he puts in quotation marks, remained a good deal more confused. There was, again he writes on page 38, outside of marriage a general unlawfulness. Now, what one did outside of marriage, in sexual terms, didn't matter as much as the fact that it was done outside of marriage. And once it was outside of marriage, whether it was, he mentions various things here, debauchery, which means extramarital relations, adultery, rape, spiritual or carnal incest, sodomy, etc., didn't matter all that much, he claims. There was general unlawfulness. Okay. Again, there is the possibility here of asking critical questions of Foucault, and I draw attention to this not because I don't like the text, I'm a big fan of Foucault's, but because I want to encourage you to read this text and every philosophical text critically, not just taking for granted what is being claimed here. One could, if one had time, if one wanted to devote a longer essay to this, or even a master's thesis, say, when Foucault says that up to the end of the 18th century, sexual discourse was all concentrated on what was going on within marriage, and outside of that there was simply stuff one is not supposed to do. Is that true? So if one were to look, let's say, at a medieval manual of confession, would there be many, many chapters about marriage? And then just a couple of chapters discussing or claiming that stuff happening outside of marriage is really sinful and not good. Is that really the picture? Again, you see something for further research. And by the way, some of this research has already occurred, given the fact that Foucault wrote the History of Sexuality in the 1970s. A lot of research has been devoted to his theses. And if you were interested in pursuing Foucault, then one of the first steps would be, or pursuing your study of the history of sexuality, one of the first steps would be to acquaint yourself with that secondary literature. But at any rate, so up to, what does he say here again, to get the dates straight? Up to the end of the 18th century, so there was outside of marriage simply general unlawfulness. I quote here from page 38. Now a change occurs. When does this change occur? Well, he now says, the discursive explosion of the 18th and 19th centuries caused this system centered on legitimate alliance to undergo two modifications. So we're talking now about 18th and 19th centuries, when he speaks of, let me see, I have the term here on page 38, he speaks of a centrifugal movement. Centrifugal movement. So a centrifugal movement is a movement outside of the center, that moves away from the center. So for discussion of sexuality now no longer centers exclusively on marriage and what's, who is allowed to marry, what one is allowed to do within marriage, etc., etc. But now there is increased attention paid to the different forms of sexual activity that can occur outside of marriage. And these are no longer simply subsumed under the general label of forbidden or unlawful, but they are investigated in their own right and distinguished. One other way in which Foucault puts this situation, summarizes this situation, occurs on page 39. And sorry for repeating that, he does write well. So he says, the area covered by the sixth commandment began to fragment. Different sexual activities that were forbidden became not simply that which is forbidden, but they became essentially different from each other. Okay. On page 40 he says, he uses again a different word to describe the situation that he's trying to describe here. He says that peripheral sexualities, a term from page 40, peripheral sexualities appear. Well, what is the periphery? Well, if you take marriage to be the center, then outside of the center you have a periphery, and this periphery now begins to be taken more seriously, undergoes distinction of various sorts, various kinds of sexuality appearing on the periphery. What are these kinds of sexuality? Well, in our modern day, we would perhaps simply say, well, there were straight people and there were gay people and that kind of thing. Well, it was much more detailed than this, and, well, almost ridiculously detailed. On page 43, Foucault gives a list of sexual aberrations that were distinguished at that point in history. And the list has technical terms which are so complicated that I had to look them all up. If you want to look them up, otherwise, just leave them. Bottom of 43, zoophiles and zooerasts now came into existence, designating sexual activities that were disallowed. Automonosexualists, mixoscopophiles, gynecomasts, presbophiles, sexoaesthetic inverts, and dysparunist women. And that's just a brief list. So as you can see, what came into existence was a kind of obsession with the precise cataloging of different forms of sexuality. Now we move on to a slightly different, slightly larger point. So, as you've already discovered from our reading of the history of sexuality so far, the book is, I wouldn't say on the surface, but in a first layer, devoted to the question of, well, the history of sexuality, as the title indicates. On another level, perhaps deeper level, more general level, more abstract level, however, Foucault uses the example of sexuality to analyze how modern power works, okay? So is modern power, modern means in our own age, is modern power simply repressive? Power meaning I have the power to eject you from the classroom or something like this. Of course we have no classroom right here. Which would be repressive. Or does modern power operate in a more sophisticated, more subtle way? Well, of course we'll find that Foucault ends up arguing it works in a more sophisticated and subtle way, using sexuality as his example. So therefore, given his interest in the history of sexuality, not only in sexuality, but in power, he now moves to discuss how power functioned in the 18th and 19th century as these peripheral sexualities came into existence. He lays this argument out on pages... Is it the rest of the chapter? Let me quickly see. It's pretty much the rest of the chapter. The discussion begins on page 41. The first point that he makes, you see it here on page 41, point 1, first point. It's indicated in the text, is this. This power that we see at work in the way in which modern sexuality is transformed into discourse and constituted on the periphery of marriage, okay? This sexuality doesn't simply try to do away this, did I say power? This power this power does not just try to do away with the forms of sexuality that it censures. Rather, it at the same time leads to a proliferation, an increase in the type of sexuality that it censures. Let me try to explain this perhaps differently or more clearly. When, before, as he now says, the 18th century, there were discussions regarding incest, that is to say, sexual relations, marriages also, between people who are too closely related. The goal of this was to stop the activity, to make sure people who are too closely related to each other don't marry each other and therefore don't engage in sexual relations with each other. So the goal was simply stop this, really suppress this. Now the goal of sexual discourse in the 18th and 19th centuries is not simply stopping the activity in question, but causing it to exist in the first place. This sounds completely ridiculous. Well, it is difficult to understand. Foucault gives the example of the obsessive attention that was given in the 18th and 19th century to the masturbation of children. How he describes it will explain to you what he means. Page 42. Educators and doctors combated children's onanism like an epidemic that needed to be eradicated. What this actually entailed throughout this whole secular campaign that mobilized the adult world around the sex of children was using these tenuous pleasures as a prop, constituting them as secrets, that is, forcing them into hiding so as to make possible their discovery. So you can see this, well, paradoxical dynamism that's at work here, forcing something into hiding in order then to be able to discover it and censor it and regulate it and so forth. Tracing them back to their source, tracking them from their origins to their effects, searching out everything that might cause them or simply enable them to exist. Wherever there was the chance they might appear, devices of surveillance were installed, traps were laid for compelling admissions, inexhaustible and corrective discourses were imposed, parents and teachers were alerted and left with the suspicion that all children were guilty and with the fear of being themselves at fault if their suspicions were not sufficiently strong. They were kept in readiness in the face of this recurrent danger, their conduct was prescribed and their pedagogy recodified. An entire medico-sexual regime took hold of the family milieu. Okay. So again, as you can see here, a very complex dynamism came into place, which didn't simply repress a certain type of sexual activity, but brought it into the open in the first place by making it secret. You know, this sounds very complicated. Let me summarize it in a very straightforward way. This phenomenon is made into a big deal, blown up, in order then to repress it. But first blown up, and you know, these two movements go hand in hand. You blow it up, you repress it. You blow it up, you repress it. Okay. First point. Second point. Pages 42 and 43. Let me summarize the second point by using a very, very famous quote here. In the last third of page 43. Foucault writes there, "The sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species." Earlier on, he speaks of the specification of individuals. Specification here has to be taken very literally or even etymologically. Individuals are put into different species, are put into different species depending on their sexual preferences. So a sexual preference is now much more than simply a fleeting phenomenon. That's what sodomy designates in, traditional Christian discourse. It means somebody has engaged in a certain type of sexual activity. This is, an individual transgression. It can be pardoned, and once it's been pardoned, you go on with your life. Okay. That's the traditional. I'll hit the pause button. Sorry about that. So that's the traditional approach. But now, so the sodomite had been a temporary aberration. A person who was guilty of a temporary lapse in judgment or giving into, his desires or something like that. But now the homosexual was a species. That is to say, medical professionals come out, psychiatrists come out, psychologists come out, etc. and say, okay, this person is intrinsically constituted by a type of sexual desire that is different from the type of sexual desire that drives other people. Okay. Foucault gives here the date of 1870, when apparently a study came out by a German doctor called Westphal, who introduced this notion of homosexuality as a medical category. One important remark at this point is this: perhaps some of you are appalled by the kinds of things that Foucault says. The sodomite had been a temporary aberration, the homosexual was now a species. Note, this is importantly, Foucault is not here engaging in gay bashing or in some kind, of anti-homosexual philosophical discourse. That's not what's going on at all. If you read a little bit about Foucault, looked him up at least in the Wikipedia, etc., you will quickly have discovered that he was himself gay, as we now say. And that at a certain point later in his life, he no longer hid that, and he lived with a partner, etc., etc., and even wrote about it. So, Foucault is not a homophobe. That's not what's going on here. In fact, one way to read this book, not the only way, is it's a book in which Foucault tries to answer the question how Foucault, came to be regarded as a homosexual, which is something that wouldn't have happened 200, 300, 400 years ago. A person may have engaged in certain acts, but then this stamp, the rubber stamp, or the putting into a drawer, or what Foucault calls the specification, would not have existed. And so how did it come into existence? Well, that's one of the questions that this book tries to answer. Okay. Third point that Foucault makes, now I'm on pages 44 and 45. Third point that Foucault makes about the kind of power which is behind the sexual discourse that occurs in the 18th and 19th centuries. There, again, if you want a memorable quotation that summarizes what Foucault tries to say here in this third point, again, pages 44 and 45, then try to remember that he speaks of perpetual spirals of power and pleasure. So what comes into existence now is a twofold dynamism. On the one hand, discussion of these and analysis, treatment of these various peripheral sexualities itself is associated with a pleasure, namely the pleasure of knowledge. By the way, that's not anything shocking or surprising at all. There is, I hope for some of you also, a pleasure that comes with knowledge. So for example, I'm explaining this text to you. It can be sometimes a little bit difficult, in particular in front of a camera. You hesitate, you wonder about how to formulate something, but ultimately there is a pleasure. The pleasure of knowing something, the pleasure of communicating knowledge, the pleasure of reading an interesting text. And that pleasure accompanies, or let me say should accompany, anyone who is genuinely after a particular type of knowledge. Let's say if you're really interested in poetry and you have to write an essay on poetry, then it's not just a horrible torture, but it gives you pleasure to write this essay on poetry. Just one of my little digressions, which of course I'm keeping to a minimum with the camera on, but just recently you may have noticed a petition appeared on the internet, a petition asking Maynooth University to implement a no detriment policy for its students so that students wouldn't in any way suffer from the current health crisis. I'm not going to comment on that now. What struck me was that when I looked at the comment section there of the petition, one student said, "My quality of life has been so horrible during the last 4 years. I've given up so much for my degree that now I'm signing this petition to get to support the no detriment policy." What made me sad there was that the student spoke about the loss of quality of life as a result of her studies. Well, see, where's the pleasure? Why is the student not experiencing any pleasure in studying, in writing essays, in thinking, in reading books? And my answer would be, perhaps she studied for the wrong reasons or the wrong subject. Studied something that in fact gives her no pleasure. So, at any rate, sorry, digression is over. And I return to Foucault's text. So, with this coming into existence of these various forms of sexuality, the pleasure of knowing about them, of talking about them, of analyzing them, of looking at the so-called patients arises. On the other hand, a different type of pleasure also arises. It's the pleasure of evading this system of categorization and of oppression. A system whereby if whatever the word here is, if one of these people who are diagnosed with this horrible form of sexuality, the presbophile, I don't even know what that means, will now, having been diagnosed in this way, derive pleasure from evading the censure, engaging in this type of sexual activity that has been identified and through this identification has been labeled, and of course labeled in a negative way. So, as you can see, what you get is what Foucault calls perpetual spirals of power and pleasure. Those categorizing the various forms of sexuality and trying to, if you will, manage them, keeping them under control, derive pleasure from engaging in that type of activity. Those who have been labeled in particular ways derive pleasure from, on their part, playing with that system, overcoming the system, subverting the system, etc. Perpetual spirals of power and pleasure. Fourthly, Foucault diagnoses what he calls devices of sexual saturation in modern society. Devices of sexual saturation. Saturation means, well, you know what saturation means. It means everything comes to be, well, totally, every human activity or very much in society acquires sexual connotation, sexual overtones. Every sphere of life comes to be seen in a sexual light. That's what he means by sexual saturation. I'll explain this more in just a second. Before I do so, I draw your attention to another famous quote from this part of this chapter. I'm on page 47 now, where Foucault writes, "Modern society is perverse, not in spite of its puritanism, or as if from a backlash provoked by its hypocrisy. It is in actual fact and directly perverse." Interesting. Page 47. Why is modern society perverse? Well, because it saturates sexually areas of life, Foucault would say almost all areas of life, that used to be not viewed from a sexual angle. The example that he gives on page 46 is the family. It's a very interesting example. He speaks of 46. The separation of grown-ups and children, the polarity established between the parents' bedroom and that of the children, etc., etc., has certain consequences. Well, just what is he talking about? Just think of Ireland, or many other European countries, or countries in the world. Some countries now, would still have these arrangements now. Think of an arrangement where, in poorer times, an entire family was sharing one room. And that wouldn't be so long ago. In farming communities, certainly in Ireland, but also in countries like Germany, or consider, farming communities in Switzerland, people wouldn't have had large houses. They would have had very simple dwellings, and in these simple dwellings, just a few rooms, or not few, couple. And everyone slept in the same room. Now, the fact that everyone slept in the same room means that, well, for example, between the parents, all kinds of stuff happened in the room, of which the children had to be aware. Now, we would say in our modern, with our modern attitude to sexuality, well, how horrible, what the parents did must have traumatized the innocent children. Well, interesting. So this traumatization apparently didn't happen. But what then started happening for social reasons, economic reasons, was a separation of the bedroom of the parents from the bedroom of the children, and then children were perhaps also put in separate bedrooms depending on their own sex. The boys into one room, the girls into another room. This, according to Foucault, made the family into a sexual space. It's interesting, you would say, didn't the opposite happen? That is to say, by segregating or separating the parents from the children and the boys from the girls, wasn't it the case that a certain desexualization occurred because, for example, the children couldn't witness what the parents were doing in their bedroom? Foucault says, well, it's the opposite. It's a saturation with sexuality because now something is constituted as a secret and therefore becomes interesting and therefore becomes a matter of investigation and of concern. So the children are perhaps wondering, well, what are the parents doing in that bedroom? And the parents are wondering, well, what are the boys doing in their segregated room, which is now different. And so, again, you can see a certain spiral beginning to come into existence. A spiral of, well, activities that come to be separated. Because they're separated, they become secret. And because they become secret, they become interesting. Because, etc., etc., etc. So, look, I think we're almost at the end of our chapter. There's perhaps one point that I ought to add here. It's at the very end of almost the end of the chapter on page 48. Foucault replies to the economic counter-argument that he raised against his position at the beginning of the chapter. It's what one could call this kind of Marxist argument, this vaguely Marxist argument, according to which sexuality was repressed in order to bring about an economically useful population and maintain a politically conservative society. Note, Foucault is rejecting this. But now here towards the end of the chapter he says, well, what he is describing as, of course, being the state of affairs in the 18th and 19th centuries, which is completely different from a repression of sexualities. It's rather what he calls this perverse implantation. And by the way, why the perverse implantation? Well, because these so-called perverse sexualities, these types of sexuality not centered on the heterosexual couple or the marriage, these perverse sexualities come to be implanted in people's bodies, because people come to be seen now as these different sexual species. The gay against the straight, the gay over against the lesbian, the trans, the bi, the questioning, etc. You know, this increasing categorization of people in terms of sexuality. Foucault will say, well, it's not that this is of no economic interest at all. There is an economic dimension. He mentions there's now medicine, psychiatry. He also says prostitution, pornography. Well, these are, less, what should I say, palatable. But just focus for a second on medicine and psychiatry. Well, these people who are now diagnosed with and who see themselves in terms of these categories will seek medical help or psychological counseling as they're grappling with the task of coming out and accepting who they really are, etc., etc. And that creates, well, economic activity. So it's not that there is no economic dimension to what's occurring, it's just different from what the, according to Foucault, too facile Marxist argument maintains. Towards the end, I will draw your attention to two possible critical questions or criticisms regarding Foucault's argument here. One of these I already raised earlier on, so it's just I'm just returning to a point that I made some minutes ago. One could ask the critical question of Foucault: is it true that the sexual realm was unfragmented before the 18th and 19th centuries? Is it true that there was that there was a highly regulated sexual activity within marriage, and that everything that occurred without marriage was simply, this is the unlawful, this is the forbidden, but we're not interested particularly what's going on with it? Is this true? Second question one could ask is, so what Foucault is arguing in this chapter is that different sexualities are historical constructs. In other modules you may have heard the technical term social constructivism. I could also speak of a cultural or historical constructivism. So Foucault is a social or historical constructivist. He will say, or he does say in this chapter, that homosexuality did not exist before the 19th century. Now, he means this in a very specific way, of course. But he does say this. You can read it up. Now, one could say, well, is it true that sexuality is a historical construct? What about homosexuality among the Greeks, for example? Isn't it the case that if you read certain Platonic dialogues, Plato is talking about, well, erotic relationships between males? So is that not homosexuality? Well, just to start reflecting on this, it's an interesting thing is, of course, the Greeks don't talk about homosexuality. That word doesn't exist. Neither does it exist in Latin, homosexualitas. Neither did they have a word for gay. So they were doing certain things, but they were clearly thinking about them in a way very different from the way we're thinking about them. So is it perhaps true that before the 19th century there were no homosexuals? So what were there then? Well, interesting questions, right? So to think about further. Well, you see, another question one could ask of Foucault is this. There is now discussion about the fact that there is perhaps a so-called gay gene. That is to say, that whether someone is gay or straight is not a matter of social construction, or it's not a matter of personal choice. It's simply that some people are born gay and other people are born straight and other people, etc., are born trans, etc. There's a gene. Now, if there's a gene, then these sexual differences are not implanted into the body in the way in which Foucault describes it, but they're natural. Some people are this way, some people are the other way, and then perhaps we're right to put them into these different species. Interesting counter-argument to Foucault, and something that I would encourage you to think about. Perhaps some of you would require a little bit of research, but I can imagine some essays being written on this. Anyway, look, I hope the lecture was okay. The most important point is helping you read the text, understand the main points of the text. Well, we'll put an end to this now. Hope you're all doing well and look forward to wanted to say seeing you again. Well, look forward to recording another lecture for you just in a couple of days so that you have something for Monday. Of course, you know the assignment, don't you? The assignment is to read part 3, which the tables of contents covers pages 51 to 75. So that's what I'm going to talk about in my next lecture. All the best now. Bye-bye.